Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Don't Stay in Your Lane, Combining Tax and IT with Your Rise with SAP Plan. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, then we'll dig into our discussion. First, we'd like to thank Vertex and Deloitte for their partnership with today's event. They've been wonderful thought leadership partners to Argyle, and they're committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. Thank you again to Vertex and Deloitte. We appreciate you joining us today. We welcome you to stay connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please follow us on Twitter at Argyle Exec Forum. I also wanted to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we've curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. Argyle is very proud and protective of this policy, as it reflects our commitment to ensure the neutrality and overall value of the content presented at our events. We've worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, please submit all questions that come up during today's event into the chat section of the interface. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll begin. Sat, let's start with you, please.
Thanks, Eric. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am Sat Saha. I'm a partner with Deloitte Tax, and I bring 15 plus years of tax integration and tax automation experience with regard to ERP systems. Functionally, I deliver indirect tax, transfer pricing, withholding tax, and direct tax integration experience within ERP systems. And I also work with with tax to deliver tax business case around making sure that the tax department has a seat at the table during finance transformation. Susie, yourself.
Hi, thanks, Sat and Eric. Susie Sue, I'm VP of SAP Business Development here at Vertex, and have been working in this space implementing tax systems with SAP customers for over 25 years. I have definitely learned a lot through that many journeys with a lot of big multinational companies, both pain and good things. And so hopefully we'll be able to share some of that insight on today's session. And I focus a lot on a lot of the SAP-based solutions we've developed over the years for our tax customers that are actually cross-functional in nature. So we've learned a lot from implementations, and we've done a lot in terms of converting those into solutions that make life easier for indirect tax teams.
Hey, thank you, Sat and Susie, for your introductions. Let's begin. So our first question is, can you please briefly explain what Rise with SAP is and what a Rise with SAP roadmap looks like? Sat, can you start us off with this question, please?
Yeah, of course. So Rise with SAP, as defined by SAP, it's a business transformation as a service product. And it mostly, right now, it focuses on shifting customers into the SAP cloud product infrastructure. And when you look at the roadmap, typically Deloitte comes in and looks at the roadmap in sort of two ways. We look at one end of the spectrum, which is your greenfield transformation. And greenfield transformation is where the client is redefining and redesigning their process, data, reporting. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got brownfield transformation, and usually it's a system upgrade, right? This is where 90% of the existing process and implementation is kind of reused, data is reused, and it mostly has to do with how fast the clients want to migrate versus, if they want to go after selective use cases and transform their business.
Yeah, and if I can supplement that, a big part of Rise with SAP is moving more and more customers to the cloud. And that includes the ERP side of things, whether we see kind of two main models, SAP S/4 public cloud, but then there's also, we see a lot of our clients are going to private cloud. And with that there's a natural, as part of that roadmap as well, is looking at all the other systems around that, and that includes any indirect tax systems as well, and taking that to the cloud as well. So we definitely see that as part of the roadmap, is you're not just migrating your ERP and your data and your use cases within that, you're also migrating a lot of your satellite systems as well. We're also seeing some expansion of other processes that impact taxes, as well as a part of SAP Rise is, ability to use Ariba Network, for example, Fieldglass, Concur, and certainly we see the adoption of that more and more with companies wanting to automate more of their upstream procure-to-pay processes, and certainly we see that entering into the roadmap as well, where, and of course that has a natural impact on indirect taxes too.
Great, thank you. So speaking of which, where does indirect tax fit into a Rise with SAP roadmap? Susie, can you continue on that subject?
Yeah, sure. I mean, indirect taxes are a key part of your finance transformation as one element, but there's actually much more to that because it does impact your entire procure to pay and your order to cash flow as well. We see that indirect taxes being very much embedded in transactions and also master data as well. That it definitely is a big part of your migration and going to the cloud. As I mentioned, not only just from an ERP standpoint, but also from the indirect tax engine as well. And naturally, along with that, companies that are looking to go to a measure of the cloud, whether it be public cloud or private cloud from an ERP standpoint, also are going to be evaluating tax engines of the same architecture as well. So for example, Vertex offers, the cloud version of their application as well as an on-demand version, both of which are certified by SAP. And, some of those integrations, for example, the cloud integration that we have utilizes iFlows that are sit within the BTP, the business transformation part of SAP Rise. And so as part of that, there are a number of components where, as you're evaluating your ERP, procure to pay, order to cash processes, there's natural tie-ins to the indirect tax call that happens, integration points. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're deploying like Ariba, there are definitely the opportunity to implement new call outs from your Ariba application and get things like budgeting, tax estimates on your Ariba purchase requisition, so that earlier on, the upstream processes can have tax estimates included. So that's something that we're seeing as part of these deployments is more and earlier on, more estimates on taxes being made as part of the overall migration strategy.
Thank you. Sat, what do you think?
Yeah, and I want to sort of echo Susie's comments around integration. A lot of my clients, when we go and do these types of implementation, if you look at the end-to-end business process around procure to pay and order to cash, integrating indirect tax on the procurement and an invoicing cycle, and similar to kind of the order to cash on a sales cycle and a billing cycle is key. Because oftentimes my clients are implementing end-to-end scenarios, whether it's during SIT, whether it's during UAT, and the cycle isn't complete without indirect tax. So it becomes a natural discussion that's seen in every client, I would say. And then the second part that I want to talk about is really the business case. So when a journey of transformation is started on the SAP side or any cloud ERP, indirect taxes can be a big part of the business case. It's got large volumes, whether it's sales or purchases, whether it's risk management, whether it's efficiency, whether it's savings. But if you look at it, all of it comes down to working capital. So if we're able to prove out that indirect taxes or leakage of indirect taxes can be part of the working capital, which is a direct sort of savings to the finance department, then it's a big benefit from an indirect tax standpoint. And, naturally tax then has a seat at the table. And then finally, I would say the other piece where indirect tax fits in is we're talking about determination, but there is also an indirect tax compliance design that becomes part of the entire global transformation. So as clients are looking at indirect tax determination, they're also standing up the data technology and process around global indirect tax compliance. And, there's many service providers for that. But that's something that my clients are increasingly, beginning to take a look at, looking at simplifying operations around that. So all of this, I think, is part of the indirect tax journey with regard to the SAP roadmap.
Great, thank you. So how can busy people keep up with rapidly changing indirect tax rules and industry conditions? Sat, can we start with you and then continue with Susie, please?
Yeah. So I would say, a couple points here, right? So automation of indirect taxes with tax engine solutions, we all know that it allows tax engines to be responsible for the rate maintenance, while our clients can focus on more value-added activities like, planning ideas around indirect taxes. The second thing that I want to talk about is I've seen a number of clients that just subscribe to rates. You can get rates by transaction types, by jurisdiction that all of these tax engines have. And so a client oftentimes where there is not a huge tax presence or not a huge tax department, they can subscribe to these tax engine, sort of rate subscription, I would say, and then let them do the tax research and then calculate the indirect taxes in-houses. And then the third piece is just clients can also use pure outsourcing, right? So I've seen clients that just outsource their tax research and their tax calculation and their reporting to third-party service providers. So I've seen kind of these spectrums that clients use from a strategy standpoint.
Yeah, and certainly over the years, when we first started implementing automated tax systems back in the early 90s, they were sort of applications that just had rates, but over time, they've gotten better and smarter and more embedded research. So what we're seeing is an amalgamation where you're able to go to a one-stop shop, a single provider that provides not only your rates, but also the research as well. And the application of content to complex transactions, it's definitely evolved beyond just a single transaction. Now you've got multiple chain type transactions, both in a company, buy sell type transactions globally, and the complexity is increased. But I think that we're seeing that tax engine providers have basically looking to provide a lot of that content ahead of time so that tax teams don't have to do that research anymore. I remember back in the days, people used to maintain their little matrices in Excel and hand them out to users to go and make decisions on purchases and manually figure out what tax codes to choose on a transaction. Well, we're definitely seeing that less and less. We're seeing more of that embedded in a connected automated tax solution with research embedded, already provided by that provider, updated on a monthly or even more frequently basis. And that is one of the key things that's really freeing up the time of tax teams, or at least changing the nature of what they spend their time on. So that, like Sat says, it's not just doing research anymore, but they're moving to more value add policy type work. And that's definitely the shift that we've seen in the last couple of decades.
So how can you make sure that your indirect tax needs are supported across all of your business operations? Susie, let's start with you on this question.
Yeah, it's a bit of a negotiation. I think that when indirect tax used to have to demand a seat at the table, I remember it was a bit like running on and kind of catch up with a moving train, because people always thought about taxes last, and it was always kind of brought in later on, and then we had to try to figure out how to get caught up with the rest of the project. That's definitely changed, and we definitely are, Sat and I both work in a business where we are very much pushing that to make sure that indirect tax is at the table very early on. And so in order to ensure that indirect taxes are supported across the business, you really have to help the organization understand. I think over time, the understanding is natural now that indirect taxes are embedded within those business processes, within order to cash, within procure to pay. And they're not a nice to have, they are essential legal compliance. And so that definitely helps. But also making sure that when we're negotiating with these teams, that when we come to the table with tax requirements, our job is not to make life harder for everybody. Our job is to help the entire procure to pay, order to cash, or the master data teams or the finance teams see how we can make their jobs more efficient. I think that's definitely something we'll talk about in a minute, but that's definitely one thing that will help ensure that indirect tax needs are supported, is making sure that we are harnessing the needs of what the other teams need, order to cash, procure to pay, IT teams. And when you can align with that, then it ensures everyone's kind of moving in the same direction.
Great, thank you. Sat, what do you think?
Yeah, I would just add, Eric, tactically speaking, what we're seeing these days is a lot of our clients, they're starting with what we call as in Deloitte a phase 0 assessment. And what a phase zero assessment is, it enables a client to think through what the roadmap needs to be, whether it's greenfield or brownfield, what are the use cases that are most relevant. So I would say tax, indirect tax, and really all of tax needs to be part of that phase zero, right? So that's point number one. The other thing that also naturally begins to bubble up through this phase zero conversation or any pre-planning sort of phase zero discussions is, let's talk about a business case, right? So a business case for finance transformation gets developed, and tax can be part of that. Indirect tax can be part of that. The other sort of things that gets developed is, what should the architecture look like? So that's another avenue where indirect tax can come in and say that, hey, have we selected a tax engine? Let's select a global central sort of tax engine to make sure that our global design is taken care of when the company starts the journey. You can also talk about reporting and compliance at the same time, right? Let's talk about what is our central sort of reporting and compliance engine once we, stand up the tax engine. So there's like multiple tools and business cases, and I would say opportunities early on. And that's the key, is early on, clients need to kind of jump into the bandwagon and help us help them.
Great, thank you. So how can we make sales and purchasing, purchasing processing more efficient? Sat, let's start with you, please.
Sure. So I think some of this we've talked about, right, with regard to, automate the indirect taxes globally, I would say, have a tax engine which you can use during global design and automate indirect taxes for both sales and purchases. The other thing with this is you're also looking at automating indirect tax compliance, right? Any VAT returns, SAFT returns, SII, right? All of those sort of country-specific returns, any e-filings that are needed, you automate that as you automate determination and have a point of view on that. Because all of that, your determination and your reporting together, when you tackle that, that makes the process efficient. And then lastly, I would say electronic invoicing, right? E-invoicing is a big deal, mandatory in many countries. So make that a part of your journey as well. And then finally, I would say just embed tax into the procure to pay and order to cash. It's something that Susie and I have brought up, time and again. And I want to sort of just echo that, because that becomes a very natural extension of making the process efficient, is when our procurement people or our sales folks, our billing folks can just call tax and say, hey, tax, there's a problem here, can you come and help us, right? So human sort of factors are also part of the efficiency.
Yeah, we talk about human factors. I mean, one of the things we have to be mindful of is the time it takes to process a document. As a result, you're finding more and more companies wanting to go to touch-free automation. And a perfect example is AP. We see a number of different vendors out there, including SAP, with applications to help reduce the amount of time that you need an accounts payable clerk to enter an invoice in. Along those lines, we want to make sure that we've calculated any taxes due correctly. We've validated the tax that a vendor has billed us, and we've determined whether or not we want to pay it, whether we need to self-assess taxes. And the ideal thing to make that whole process efficient is to be able to ensure that we handle the taxes correctly, real time, first time, without having to do any corrections and without having to require AP to step in and manually manipulate that invoice. And I think that's where automation is very much key. An automation that is connecting an indirect tax engine with all of its logic to the AP process within SAP or even outside of SAP, and making sure that you've designed it where you're automating not just part of it, but the whole thing. Because the last thing you want to do is automate, let's say, the tax calculation, but you don't automate the AP process of dealing with the tax calculation and handling things like accruals. So I think when you design kind of what Sat refers to, kind of an end-to-end global solution, you really do need to automate that truly from end to end, and factor in the human cost of processing documents through the procure to pay or the order to cash process. So that's something that tax implementation teams like Deloitte, when you come to the table and you're figuring out how to design that, you've really got to kind of work through that, all those challenges, and making sure that you've got legal compliance, as well as making sure real time everything's being calculated and accrued correctly, and making sure that there's no human cost to doing that. So quite a lot to juggle, but it definitely is feasible and doable. And we've helped a lot of companies collectively, get there.
Great, thank you. Susie, this next question is for you, and that is, how can we address cybersecurity concerns that arise when we move indirect tax management to the cloud?
Yeah, I think back to where we were 10 plus years ago, and there was definitely a hesitation toward, indirect tax engines in the cloud. And, given the sensitive nature of, the transactional data. And certainly, the way that companies like Vertex address that is to the highest industry standards. I mean, you've really got to, in order to be able to deploy your application in the cloud. But you've got to look at it two ways. So one is the data flow. The flow of data that's typically used for a tax calculation normally doesn't contain personal info. So that's one layer of protection, in that the information that needs to be sent to the tax engine should include, whether it's a company code or a product ID or the amounts or the, the tax IDing location, delivered in a way that doesn't compromise any personal data. That's one aspect. And then the other is just from a technology standpoint, the security measures that the tax cloud providers have to ensure that they adhere to, everything from the firewalls and the monitoring, making sure you've got secured redundant data centers, making sure you're transmitting data through the HTTPS protocol, which is encrypted, ensuring that you've got your SSL certificates renewing, at least every 12 months. And then on top of that, many companies and regulators are requiring SOC 1 Type 2 and SOC 2 Type 2 certifications around internal controls on content and around your security controls around cloud environment. So definitely there are a lot of established industry requirements, legal requirements, regulatory requirements that any indirect tax provider that is looking to be able to deliver on the cloud really does have to adhere to.
Great, thank you. So Sat, what are the training needs that come up in indirect tax transformation?
Yeah, so Eric, change management is a very big work stream that is a horizontal work stream that typically is in place during any of these transformation projects. And we get to work, so tax work stream, we get to work with the change management work stream to define, like I said, tax specific trainings, and then have super users be trained on those trainings. And oftentimes we would conduct region-based trainings during the rollout. And then we would also sort of leverage the general procure to pay or order to cash or finance trainings that also gets delivered during the implementation, and then have the tax super users sit in and get educated, because they have to understand this from an end to end. They don't have to just understand what does it mean to sort of deliver tax engine integration. They also have to understand kind of the end to end process. So part of delivering these trainings, we sort of engage with web-based or live trainings on a lot of these topics, and then depending on the client needs, we sort of bring it down holistically, and then hopefully this triggers change management as well, because they're kind of used to a way of delivering sort of tax automation before the project. There is a need to sort of change that. So part of what we also hope through this training is that it triggers the right change in people.
Thank you. So what do you think?
One of the things that helps with the change management is if the change makes a job easier. So I think to the extent, and this all goes back to how you design things. And then, when you're training the users, whether it's like Sat says, the P2P team or the order to cash team, is that if you're able to help them see impacts, but also what they need to do a little bit differently and hopefully make it less work, I think that definitely makes it a lot easier for change management to be absorbed in an organization. We definitely find that being able to go upstream and make life easier makes the go forward changes a lot easier as well.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what are some common pain points that you've encountered in getting IT and tax to work more closely together, and how did you get past them? Susie, let's start with you, please.
Sure. Two areas come to mind. One is on just reporting and getting data, let's say out of SAP for the tax team that they need. So this is an area where you might find tax needing to lean on IT to build them custom queries or reports in order to get everything that they need. So that's one area that we've seen them having to work together. How we've gotten past that is Well, we at Vertex made it very easy. We actually built a program that does the reporting for them, and they just have to deploy it. So what that does, it gives tax what they need without having to lean on IT to build something custom. The second area is around testing. And there's this whole testing gap that happens with indirect taxes. And the way it arises is from an indirect tax standpoint, a lot of tax teams need to test many different scenarios, different iterations, and be able to test many different products and services that you're buying and selling across different regions or countries. And with all those combinations, you could easily end up with hundreds of test cases needing to be run. A lot of times, IT teams don't have the resources to support that measure of testing, especially when it comes to being able to create tests within SAP, capturing the entire data set needed to handle that. So that's an area where we've seen them have it to either work together or at the end of the day, really compromise. That's another area that we at Vertex sort of, developed a solution to try to bring those two needs together, where we're able to deploy a test automation. So to the extent that we can meet very complex tax needs without requiring a lot of IT time, that's where it's a sweet spot where everybody gets what they need without having to devote a lot of resources.
Great, thank you. Sat, what do you think? What's your experience been in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I think we heard Susie talk a lot about kind of the back half of a project, right? Implementation, testing, which I absolutely agree with, by the way. We've seen challenges on that. Where I've also seen challenges is in the front half of the project. So there's two sort of common areas that I've seen. One is, if you think about, most of the times, tax may actually be late to the journey, right? They may be late to the table. They don't have a seat at the table. And one of the things that we try to do is prevent that from happening by educating our clients early on in the process during a phase 0 assessment. We've already talked about that, as to why tax should have a seat at the table and how should tax communicate with IT in order to secure that seat. And oftentimes, what we end up doing is helping clients build up a tax business case, educating not just tax, but other stakeholders within the client, like P2P, like order to cash, where there is integration touch points, and therefore bridging the gaps and then securing that seat at the table and really starting or sparkling kind of that journey that's needed for tax. The other thing that's sort of, I would say, connected to this is tax is part of the large business process of P2P and order to cash. We've many times mentioned this, but the challenge oftentimes is we don't necessarily have a tax module in SAP, right? For all the right reasons. And sometimes, if you think about it from an IT standpoint, it could be challenging to understand the integrated nature of tax business requirements, because most people sort of see this with the lens of modules, right? You've got a material management module, you've got a sales and distribution module, but because you don't have a tax module, it's a little bit challenging to understand the upstream sort of tax data requirements that are sitting within various points of the P2P and order to cash process. So oftentimes what we would do is, from a Deloitte standpoint, we would distill those data requirements for indirect taxes at a country level and present it in a very consumable version and say that, hey, these are the requirements that come from P2P, and these are the ones that belong to order to cash. And therefore, it becomes a much easier journey for the IT folks to understand tax requirements and vice versa. So I would say those are the common challenges that we kind of encountered in the start, in the beginning half of the journey.
Great. So how can tax professionals make sure that their cloud-based tax management system is scalable? Sat, let's start with you and continue with Susie.
Yeah, so there's, again, I would say there's a couple of things that comes to mind. One is absolutely start with a global design approach, right? When you start your tax management system, you look at global design in terms of tax code setups, tax procedure setup, both in SAP and the tax engine. You also look at having a single determination engine to the extent possible. You look at things like a single indirect tax compliance reporting engine to the extent, again, possible. So you kind of look at reducing your footprint, having a global design approach in order to then, set your system up for scalability. The other thing that we've also seen in clients today is not just from a technology standpoint, these tax engines, they don't just need to communicate with the ERP platforms like SAP, but they also need to communicate with boundary systems. I think Susie mentioned Ariba in the beginning of this seminar. We've also talked about other boundary systems. There can be Concur, there can be sales systems. There's a whole host of boundary systems. Companies many times get managed within its own system. So the tax engine needs to be kind of your focal point, and it needs to connect with all of these boundaries as well. And then finally, I would say, looking at your technical debt, right? When we kind of embark on this journey, the clients want to sort of reduce your technical debt, and it's always a benefit versus kind of the challenge thing. And having, again, that single focal point, that single engine to reduce your technical debt just reinforces what IT needs in this kind of a journey.
Yeah, it's interesting, that I've observed, the last couple of decades that there's a move toward single sourcing, right? And not having, different tax applications that do different things. And I think that's definitely where most companies want to go now, is to kind of reduce that footprint across different vendors and sort of have as much of a one-stop shop as possible. At the same time, you want to make sure that that single vendor is able to service your needs and grow with you. So it's important to have that vendor that handles a lot of the other companies that are in your industry or in your space or where you're looking to go. Because, any of those tax vendors that you're looking at, Vertex included, really responds to what the customers are asking for. And so if customers are moving toward Ariba, then there's definitely a push to ensure that there's an Ariba Vertex integration built, and that's just a natural flow of how development and innovation is going to happen. Is a lot of it's going to be driven by what customers need and where companies collectively are going. So definitely seeing that more, the demand is being placed on these tax engines providers to do more and to answer more of the questions, so that companies don't have to go through 5 or 6 different vendors to handle all that they need within the indirect tax compliance and reporting flow.
Thank you. So where do AI and ML fit into evolving tax management technology? Susie, let's start with you and then wrap up with SAP.
Yeah, I think this is a very exciting area of innovation for all of us. And, folding in AI and what it can do, because when you think about it, tax departments are still having to apply a lot of manual process, or, order to cash or procure to pay users are still having to provide manual decision process that can be replaced ultimately, or at least, more efficient. And so there's a number of areas that I can see that happening. Everything from the point of mapping data from SAP, for example, into a tax decision. That might be done manually by somebody, being able to use AI to look for clues, to look for benchmark data that has already been done by other companies and drive that mapping based on that AI knowledge. And that's something that Vertex is invested in as well. Being able to analyze the results. I think that a lot of tax teams still deal with errors and still have to deal with the correction of incorrect taxes either being charged or being paid or accrued. And tax teams are still having to spend a lot of time manually reviewing reports to figure out, did we pay the right taxes? Did the user code the document correctly? So being able to bring AI into that, I think, is going to help tax teams handle a lot of that review without somebody actually having to go line by line through transaction activity. A third area is being able to test. I think that's going to be a big area of growth as well. Test automation and closing what I referred to earlier with the testing gap. I think where we can replace the need for users to do the testing or even to build the test scripts to look for the data, to the extent that we can use AI to do that, is going to yield a lot of benefit for companies.
Thank you. Sat, what do you think?
Yeah, so I would definitely echo what Susie just said. Again, 3 use cases that we primarily see in this space is just review and doing, just repetitive tasks, invoice scanning, one of the areas that our procure to pay teams use. The other thing I would say is a lot of these clients, they're not coming with a lot of tax content being built within these systems, right? Especially on the ERP side. So if we can make sure that there is pre-configured tax content, just like you have on the engine side, you also need to build a complement on the SAP side, on the boundary system side. So, SAP systems could be pre-configured with client-specific tax content, so that whenever sprints are happening, the pre-configured content is getting built with an automated solution, and it's ready for consumption by the project teams. And the project teams then just focus on the gaps that exist, relative to the process and data against the requirements, right? And then the third thing that Susie brought about, test automation. That's, again, a big deal for multinationals, because today, if you look at multinationals who are across, 100 plus jurisdictions, they want to make sure that testing is robust. They know the risk exposure for tax in so many jurisdictions. So we see more and more of our clients needing a much more robust and a much more extensive set of test scenarios that cover a sort of a wider range and repeatable test automation sets. And therefore, having those sets being automated can not only just help during the transformation, but also after go live, because defects are coming. You kind of need the same sort of test cases to come through and make its way from a repeatable, country testing standpoint. So test automation is something that Deloitte is also looking at in a big way, because again, it's standardized, it's repeatable. Every client that's a multinational needs it. So we're investigating a lot into that and investing a lot into that as well.
Great. Thank you, Sat and Susie, for that insightful discussion. We'd like to open the webinar up for Q&A, and we encourage attendees to submit your questions using the chat feature. So why don't we start and address some of the questions that have been submitted by the audience, the first of which is, we are struggling to keep up with changing indirect tax rules. Do you have any advice for us? Who wants to take the first swing at that one?
I can take it. Indirect tax rules, as we've already talked about before, one of the primary ways you can sort of get over that is by having a single tax engine to solve for that, right? Because the tax engine already comes with rates and rules and jurisdiction-specific content. So you leave it to the engine who has the research to come in with the content and make sure that the research is up to date. And then a lot of times, if you're not using the engine for tax calculation, at least subscribe to them on a monthly basis, like Susie talked about earlier. You can download the rates and make sure that your calculation is right within your infrastructure, but at least the content, you don't have time to research the content, you're at least getting the content from someone who's done it for you.
Great. Susie, what do you think on that one?
Yeah, just to dovetail what Sat was saying is that it's important that that research content is actually vetted, not just by the people researching it, but by the industry using it. And so we find that that's very helpful, is that there are, users will definitely vet that content as well, as part of, because there definitely are interpretation differences of the rules. And so I think that being part of a larger community that subscribes to that content, where there can be kind of a feedback loop on that, can be quite helpful for companies. You're not on an island, basically, doing your own research.
Great. So what's the biggest mistake you've seen companies make in trying to improve their indirect tax management, and how do they get past it? Susie, can we start with you on that one?
Probably the biggest mistake I've seen is when you bake into your design too much manual work. You're relying on users. And, I always go to the most skeptical view on things, and that is that users, even if they've been trained on how to do something, are always going to find the easiest way to do it, or there may be so much turnover that your training will basically, be less effective. And so I always try to go into an implementation with the most skeptical view, and basically, not expect users to make the correct decisions all the time. And so a perfect example with indirect tax automation is we rely on the data inputs on, for example, a purchase requisition or a purchase order, material groups, GL accounts, the cost objects being entered. We're relying on that to be entered correctly. And you subsequently have to then go and train those users to enter that in correctly, just as Sat had mentioned, regional trainings or focused training on how users can interact with the system in order to get the right results. Well, my view is if you always rely on the users to do that correctly, you can be baking in an error ratio. So it's always a good idea to go in with a skeptical eye and to have some maybe system rules that can override inputs in order to achieve the correct taxing result. That's one area of downfall I see, and that's how I would typically address it.
Thank you. Sat, what do you think?
Yeah, and I would probably extend Susie's point of view into reporting, because oftentimes what happens is when the data upstream isn't right, you need some place to compensate for that. So if you're not building the point of view of reporting during the journey, you're essentially standing up a solution that's half-baked, right? And then you kind of release it to the users, and the users, sometimes they wouldn't know what to do with it, right? So if you look at it from an end-to-end and you have a journey for determination, and you also complement that with reporting, what you're doing is for every data that is deficient, which is a reality, unfortunately, but every data that is deficient, you have a reporting fix to it, which ideally then would enable a much greater sort of change management and adoption of the product.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how do you anticipate that tax automation is going to evolve over the next couple of years? Sat, let's start with you, and then we'll conclude with Susie.
Yeah, I think just a couple of things, Eric. One of the things that we continue to see in the market is the IT landscape is simplifying with regard to digital core, but there's also a lot of other sort of boundary systems that are beginning to sort of crop up. So I do see that the tax engines will become more and more flexible and nimble to have sort of standard integration with regard to many of these products other than SAP, right? Ariba, you call SAP Brim. So I think there is more and more need for standard integration and maintenance. So that's kind of one area that I would say. The other thing that I want to talk about is also reporting and compliance. People 10 years back, or even as far as 5 years back, used to think about this in isolation of, hey, for transaction processing, I just want to make sure my indirect tax determination works. People don't really think about it now in that context only because you have month-end reporting as a process. And so indirect tax month-end reporting becomes part of the process of kind of the larger sort of enterprise month-end reporting. So people are thinking about both determination and reporting as things that they want to tackle during a finance transformation journey.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, is that it's going even beyond that even further. We're seeing, into the future, even the now, where we're at right now, is that companies are wanting their tax solutions to, yes, go beyond just calculation and go beyond just returns and reporting or exemption certs. They want their tax applications to be smarter. They want their tax applications to be able to self-regulate, look for errors, auto-correct for errors that might have come from human input or error. And also, and that kind of gets back to what we talked about earlier with AI and bots and being able to deploy solutions that can replace human effort to a degree. But yeah, we're definitely just seeing that companies are looking for more applications that don't just solve a single thing and really will help not just the tax process, but also the upstream process, whether it's procure to pay, order to cash, master data, finance. I think that companies are looking for their tax applications and any impact areas that they have to deliver solutions around that as well. So that at the end of the day, our customer is not just the tax department, but it is a wider group within the organization.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for questions. Thank you, Sat and Susie, for that excellent presentation. And thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today for this webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.